All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for the California Fire Science Seminar Series. My name is Emma Kraus, and I will be the host for today. I'm a member of the student committee who assisted in organizing and selecting speakers for the California Fire Science Seminar Series. I'm currently a senior at UC Berkeley. I study conservation resource studies with a special interest or focus in fire and forest ecology. Um, the California Fire Science Seminar Series is organized and supported by the California Fire Science Consortium, the Fire Research Group, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Merced. I participated in the student committee, which was integral to the success of the seminar series. It was comprised of 18 students and postdocs from across the nation who helped select speakers and topics. This webinar is also recorded and will be posted on the California Fire Science Consortium website, as well as our YouTube channel, if you want to look at the recording later or share it later on. Following today's presentation, there will also be a Q&A session, so feel free to add questions you have in the Q&A chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those afterward. Today's seminar is titled Untrammeling the Wilderness, Restoring Natural Conditions Through the Return of Human-Ignited Fire. This is presented by Claire Borrichter. She's a fire research fellow, science writer, and former wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service. She is currently the Wilderness Fire Research Fellow for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is part of the U.S. Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station. Claire's research focuses on federal wilderness fire management, including the challenges, barriers, and the benefits to the use of prescribed fire in wilderness landscapes. Now, please joining me is Claire. Welcome. I think you're still muted, Claire.
Here we go. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Emma. It's really great to be here. And thanks to the student committee for inviting me to speak about my work today. As the Wilderness Fire Research Fellow for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, I've spent the last year and a half thinking about the relationships between wilderness ecosystems, fire, and people, alongside this really lovely group of folks who make up the Wilderness and Fire Research team. Together, we produced a paper titled Untrammeling the Wilderness, Restoring Natural Conditions Through the Return of Human-Ignited Fire. Today, I'm going to talk about this work, as well as a little bit about some of the questions we're thinking about today. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and provide some context, speaking to the questions, what is federally designated wilderness? Who am I and why am I doing this work? What is the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute? And why does our research team focus on wilderness fire? Thanks so much, guys. What a way to start. So here we are. I wanted to acknowledge this is my research team, these lovely folks here. And together we produce this work, Untrammeling the Wilderness. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I dive in, I'm going to provide some context more on, what is wilderness, what brought me to this work, what is my institute, and why we're focusing on wilderness fire. So in 1924, 750,000 acres in New Mexico were designated as the Gila Wilderness, the first time this wilderness designation was made in the United States. While the predominant land management thinking of this period primarily saw forests as valuable resources to be wisely and efficiently managed, the philosophy behind the idea of wilderness was radically different. In contrast, wilderness landscapes were to be left in their natural states as places where all parts of an ecosystem were acknowledged as valuable and worth conserving. Conservationist Aldo Leopold was an early and dedicated advocate of wilderness. as he writes in a Sand County Almanac. The outstanding scientific discovery of the 20th century is not television or radio, but rather the complexity of the land organism. Only those who know the most about it can appreciate how little we know about it. The last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, "What good is it?" If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. Over the following decades, wilderness advocates gained broad support for the concept of wilderness, and in 1964, the Wilderness Act was passed by Congress. The Act created the National Wilderness Preservation System and provides robust legal protections for wilderness areas. Today, this system is comprised of 806 wilderness areas and more than 111 million acres of land spread across 44 states and Puerto Rico, making it the largest highly protected conservation network in the world. These areas are protected from development such as road building, logging, and mining, with federal land managers directed to preserve these areas in their natural conditions for generations to come. I wanted to include this slide just to show the vast range of wilderness across the United States. And I'd also really love to get a sense of some of the wilderness areas that folks here have experienced. So if you've gotten to visit wilderness, or if you're a frequent wilderness visitor and you want to pick your favorite, go ahead and throw some of those in the chat. I'll be excited to look and see what those spaces are. So I had my first experiences in wilderness when I was 20 years old. I drove across the country from my hometown in Iowa to join a crew of Forest Service firefighters in Utah. My fire crew specialized in managing wildfires burning in wilderness. Instead of suppressing these wilderness fires, we provided the information and support that allowed them to be managed, and in this way to play their vital ecological role across the landscape. Coming from Iowa, where almost every landscape has been so vastly altered, spending this time in wilderness was truly transformative for me. During 2-week-long assignments in the wilderness, I got to experience myself as one small part in a teeming community of life. Over the course of my 3 fire seasons, these experiences showed me again and again the value of wilderness. Places where all parts of an ecosystem are meant to exist, where human actions are restrained, and where I could feel myself connected intimately to the natural world. In graduate school at the University of Minnesota in my late 20s, I found myself again thinking about wilderness, fire, and people as the environmental storyteller for the University of Minnesota's Research and Experimental Forest, the Cloquet Forestry Center. As the environmental storyteller for the center, I was tasked with telling the story of a 40-acre stand of old-growth red pines, which had been set aside to be left largely unmanaged as an informal wilderness. Interestingly, the stand was not doing particularly well. The old-growth red pines were failing to regenerate, and as you can see in this photo of me here standing in this stand, the undergrowth had gone absolutely wild, indicating significant changes in an ecosystem that would historically have been open and park-like. These changes were due in large part to the removal of regular surface fires. Red pines are a fire-adapted species, but since the area had become an experimental forest, the stand had been unburned. This story became even more complex when the center's location is taken into consideration. The center is located fully within the reservation of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. The Fond du Lac are part of the Anishinaabe people who have a long history of burning across this region for a variety of purposes, including the promotion of blueberries, a staple subsistence crop. So not only was this stand of red pines missing cycles of fire, it was likely missing fire that had been intentionally ignited by people. Eventually, it was this and other work that led me to my current position as a research fellow with the Leopold Institute. So the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, or ALRI for short, is a research institute where scientists, social scientists, and research fellows like me study a range of different issues affecting wilderness. Through our work, we aim to support the management of wilderness and other protected areas across the United States. We often collaborate on this work with managers, academics, tribes, communities, and other partners on everything from biodiversity to visitor use to fire within wilderness. Here I've taken just a few screenshots of some of the work that's ongoing at the Leopold Institute. My team focuses on wilderness and fire because, as for so many of our landscapes, fire has been excluded from almost all wilderness for the last 120 years. There are some notable exceptions. A handful of large wilderness areas have long-standing programs of managing wildfire, which I'll talk about more later on. For many fire-adapted wilderness landscapes, the absence of cycles of burning has induced far-reaching, substantial, and negative consequences. This includes wilderness ecosystems less resilient to climate change and more vulnerable to uncharacteristically severe wildfires. In some cases, uncharacteristically severe fires have led to vegetation type conversion, causing forests to become shrublands, grasslands, or other vegetation types completely. These major ecosystem changes have prompted tough questions about what it means to conserve and manage wilderness landscapes for future generations. At Alry, research ecologist Sean Parks has been closely studying the effects of fire exclusion on wilderness. In 2023, collaborators at Western Colorado University convened a wilderness and fire workshop in Gunnison to connect with fire experts from land management agencies, tribes, and other organizations. This conference served as a springboard for the work that I'm doing today. And if you're interested in learning more about that conference and the white paper that was produced from it, you can use that QR code right there to take a look at barriers and opportunities for wilderness fire. So this brings us to untrammeling the wilderness. In discussing this work, I'll be speaking to the wilderness management dilemma, historical Indigenous fire stewardship, the state of wilderness and fire in the 21st century, returning good fire to wilderness, and the next questions we're exploring. The question of how to appropriately manage wilderness has been actively debated for decades. The Wilderness Act defines wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Untrammeled is not a word that most of us use every day, but the framers of the Wilderness Act chose it specifically. You can think of it as meaning landscapes unhindered by people or self-willed. After this, the Act goes on to mandate that wilderness landscapes be managed to retain their primeval character and influence, as well as being managed to preserve their natural conditions. From these two directives, a central tension of wilderness management has emerged. As the Act is currently interpreted, even management actions that aim to achieve positive ecological outcomes work against this idea of untrammeled wilderness. Yet preserving a wilderness area's natural conditions does at times require some degree of intervention by people, such as limiting the spread of invasive species. Because of these contradictions, wilderness managers must often balance their approach to wilderness. At times, this has led to hands-off management as the default. The wilderness management dilemma becomes even more complex as we as a broader society have begun to recognize the extent to which Indigenous peoples shaped landscapes prior to Euro-American colonization, and this includes wilderness landscapes. The Wilderness Act was created during an era when development and mechanization was rapidly altering landscapes. The goal was to protect these places from people. But as many Indigenous peoples remind us, human actions are not inherently bad for the natural world. In many belief systems, people are viewed as part of, rather than separate from, the land they live on. As I'm sure many of us are well aware, the legacy of America's protected lands is intertwined with the land dispossession and genocide carried out against Indigenous peoples across this country. Spence, in Dispossessing the Wilderness, talks at length about the removal of tribes from their homelands in order to create national parks, as well as the weaponization of concepts of unpeopled wilderness to erase tribes and their practices. This concept of unpeopled wilderness persists today. As the bond states, whether one sees the cultivation that human hands have done in a particular landscape depends to some extent on whether one looks for it and whether one is prepared to see it. Wilderness is a concept that can incline one not to look, hence not to see. An example I learned about recently that illustrates this statement relates to agaves. So as Hodgson discusses, Indigenous people domesticated at least 6 species of agave that are more palatable than wild agaves and were traded and transported between northern Mexico and northern Arizona. Today, we know that at least 4 of these species can be found in designated wilderness. In this photo here, Mescalero and Fort Sill Apache elders are instructing youth on the correct way to harvest agave. Intentional burning is one way in which tribes have profoundly influenced landscapes across North America. Multiple lines of evidence, from oral histories to pollen and charcoal sediment cores to tree ring fire scar records and early land survey records, demonstrate and affirm the prevalence of Indigenous fire and its role in shaping ecosystems. I'm going to speak to 3 examples of historical Indigenous fire stewardship. In the Indiana Summit Research National Area in California, a landscape that's managed much like wilderness, work by Slatton and others has highlighted the relationship between the Paiute people of the Eastern Sierra Nevadas, fire, and a traditional food source. Historically, Paiute people dug trenches around the bases of Jeffrey pines to facilitate the harvest of piaji, or Pandora moth larvae, a traditional food source. This involved raking out the trenches or piaji rings around the Jeffrey pines. Here you can see a graphic of how this process worked, and I'll give everyone a second to take a look. It's pretty cool. So these piaji rings are still noticeably present in the Indiana Summit area, as you can see here in this photo. And really interestingly, researchers found that Pandora moth eggs appeared more abundant on trees blackened by fire, suggesting that frequent fires played a role in this practice. Today, a study of piaji rings observed that when rings were tended by raking this litter back from the base of the trees and out of the trenches, these trees survived in greater numbers in a recent severe fire than those that did not have these rings present. My second example is from what is today the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. This area is the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe, who historically ignited fires along commonly traveled waterways in the Boundary Waters. This practice was essentially stopped in the early 1900s when the area was designated as public land and fire towers, as shown here, were constructed to facilitate the suppression of fire. As current research by Kiffmuller and Larson affirms, these historical Anishinaabe fires influenced the landscapes of the Boundary Waters. They facilitated the establishment and persistence of fire-adapted red pines. They maintained clear park-like openings that were used for camping, and they promoted the growth of blueberries. Today, visitors to the Boundary Waters Wilderness can still see signs of historical Anishinaabe practices. In this photo on the top right, you can see a cultural modification known as a peel. This peel would have caused resin to flow from this red pine. Mixed with charcoal or soot and a little bit of grease or fat, this pitch becomes a sticky, flexible substance that's ideal for repairing birch bark canoes. My third example is from the Northeast. This is not an area that I know too well, but I did want to highlight this recent work by Tuluwiki. Here he's mapping historical descriptions of Indigenous fire from the 17th to the 19th century across the region. And if you follow that QR code, you can go to his story map and poke around. It's a really interesting and user-friendly tool. Here I've taken a screenshot of just one of those observations. The turn of the 20th century brought substantial changes to fire in America. The forced removal of tribes from their homelands and the criminalization of traditional practices of cultural burning largely eliminated Indigenous fire stewardship for decades. You can see in the Chief Fire Warden document highlighted, these are specific policies of burning criminalization that were occurring in the Boundary Waters region in Minnesota. So this became an era of full suppression of wildfires as Euro-Americans brought vastly different perspectives to land management. Deadly and destructive fires like the Great Fire of 1910, which burned 3 million acres across Idaho, Montana, Washington, and British Columbia and killed 87 people, further fueled the drive to eliminate all fires on the landscape. The drive to suppress fire remains strong today. The Forest Service estimates that firefighters suppress 98% of wildfires before they grow larger than 300 acres. The exclusion of fire from fire-adapted landscapes has led to significant ecological changes in forests, as you can see in these two repeat photos from 1890 to 1970. So this area historically would have experienced frequent fire. These changes extend to entire landscapes, as we can see here in the Eagle Cap Wilderness in Oregon. For forests adapted over millennia to regular cycles of burning, the removal of fires can cause infilling of trees, loss of fire-adapted species, and an increase in dead and downed trees and undergrowth that serve as fuel. You can see that happening in these photos in the 1993 and 2008 photos, comparing to the 1925 photo. And then when fire does inevitably return, many of these ecosystems are now burning at a severity that is uncharacteristic. Where these landscapes may have benefited from regular low or moderate intensity fires in the past, they're often negatively affected by these high intensity, high severity fires. And you can see in 2013, this is following a fire that occurred in 2012, and it's decimated this ecosystem here. Today, we're increasingly seeing large and destructive fires like this one. This is the East Troublesome Fire, the second largest wildfire in Colorado's history, which burned nearly 200,000 acres and destroyed over 500 structures. Contemporary fires are increasingly unlike historical fires. Here I pulled a graph from recent work by McClure that's demonstrating the loss of fires in the Southwest beginning in the early 1900s as we enter this suppression phase. And we can see that more frequent fires being replaced by less frequent but more severe fires in these landscapes. Unsurprisingly, the hotter and drier conditions associated with climate change are also exacerbating the situation. These are graphs from my collaborator Sean Park's work at Alry. And as we all know, we're still down here when it comes to climate change. So the likelihood is that the effects of climate change are only going to continue to intensify and compound what we're seeing with fire. So what does this mean for wilderness? Just as on other landscapes, contemporary fire, which is increasingly unlike historical fire, is driving long-term ecosystem changes within wilderness, which is being compounded by climate change. In our recent work, we posit that this exclusion of fire over the last century or more is not only negatively affecting the natural conditions of wilderness, but is itself a trammel. By excluding fire from fire-adapted wilderness ecosystems through fire suppression and the removal of human-ignited fire, we are altering a historical ecological process and thus hindering these wilderness landscapes. The changes we are seeing to forested wilderness landscapes are substantial and long-term. The photos here marked A, B, and C show historically forested wilderness that in centuries prior would have experienced regular cycles of burning. Following recently uncharacteristically severe fires, we can see what they look like now. They've lost a huge number of trees and are potentially at risk of converting to non-forest. In the photo marked D, in the Dome Wilderness, we can see where this has happened. This formerly forested site is now likely to remain a shrub field. We're also seeing other cascading long-term and negative effects from fire exclusion. One example can be seen in New Mexico's Gila Wilderness, which, if you remember, is the first ever wilderness to be designated in the US. So in the Gila, debris flows prompted by uncharacteristically severe fires have extirpated populations of Gila trout, a federally listed species. Something similar is happening in the Mount Lassick Wilderness in California, where fire exclusion and subsequent ecosystem changes are major factors behind the listing of the Lassick's lupine as an endangered species. You can see the quote at the bottom, "Smokey the Bear screwed us." So given this need to restore fire, how can we bring good fire back to wilderness? The first approach to fire restoration could come through the increased management of wilderness wildfires. This strategy was implemented in select wilderness areas beginning in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, including in the Selway Bitterroot, Bob Marshall, and Frank Church wildernesses. In this photo, we see the Fitz Creek fire burning in the Selway Bitterroot in 1973. This is one of the first wildfires that was ever managed for benefit. A group of researchers known as the Whitecap Five studied these managed fires, identifying a number of benefits. Post-fire, fuel loads were generally reduced and landscapes became more heterogeneous or patchy, which in turn mitigated the severity of later wildfires. Ecosystems also responded positively and quickly, with a number of species resprouting post-burn and mammals and birds quickly returning to these burned areas. However, the management of wildfires has largely failed to restore fire regimes in wilderness across the US, and that's largely due to lack of implementation and a still strong fire suppression bias. No one will lose their job when they decide to suppress a fire, but if a manager decides to manage a fire and something goes wrong, the consequences can be severe. While this is quite rare, less than 1% of the Forest Service's yearly 4,500 burns escapes. It can weigh really heavily on decision makers. Another approach to fire restoration is the ignition of prescribed fires. This brings many of the same benefits as managing wildfires while allowing managers greater control. Instead of having to quickly make decisions about whether or not to manage a wildfire that's ignited under potentially hot and dry conditions or in forests that are now overgrown or whose ecosystems have dramatically changed, prescribed burning allows managers to choose when and where to burn and to plan for that. Prescribed burning is legal and permissible in wilderness, where it is considered the minimum necessary action to preserve wilderness character. However, this remains a rare practice, in part because some consider such burning to be inappropriate. Yet, despite these existing barriers, some wilderness areas have been able to successfully implement prescribed burns. This includes the Sequoia Kings Canyon Wilderness, where more than 36,000 acres have been treated with fire since 1984. In 2021, a grove that had been treated with prescribed fire fared notably better in a high severity fire compared to an untreated grove. Despite being incredibly well adapted to fire, giant sequoias have been dying in startling numbers in recent severe fires. In 2020, for example, the Castle Fire is estimated to have killed between 10 to 14% of giant sequoias across the Sierra Nevadas. Given this reality, prescribed burning could be seen as a pathway to protecting the natural conditions of wildernesses, like Sequoia Kings Canyon Wilderness. Similarly, a multi-year burning project in the Scapegoat Wilderness in Montana restored fire to 16,000 acres. District Ranger Mike Munoz later observed that this burning moderated the effects of 3 subsequent wildfires. Beyond fire restoration, the use of human-ignited fire in wilderness acknowledges the influence of Indigenous fire stewardship in shaping American landscapes and increases the potential for federal and tribal collaborations today. In California, the Carrick tribe has been a leader in restoring cultural fire. Recently, the tribe entered into a first-of-its-kind agreement with the state of California, which recognizes the tribe's expertise and makes cultural burning less onerous for the tribe to implement. I also highly recommend these 2 good fire papers are really wonderful to learn more. Speaking about this legislation, Geneva Thompson of the California Natural Resource Department stated, "I think this legislation is part of that broader effort to correct those older laws that have caused harm and really think through, how do we respect and support tribal sovereignty, respect and support traditional ecological knowledge, but also meet the climate and wildfire resiliency goals that we have as a state?" In the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, fire has been restored to 49,000 acres, and this has lowered the intensity and severity of 2 subsequent wildfires. An additional 26,000 acres have been proposed for burning, and this proposal was shaped in consultation with Bois Forte, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage bands, bands for whom the Boundary Waters Wilderness is an ancestral homeland. As stated by Damon Ponick, an Anishinaabe fire practitioner who was instrumental in restoring cultural burning to the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore near the Boundary Waters. You think of all these national parks and natural areas. Their conditions, which prompted them to become protected, are the result of the management of fire over all these years. The Boundary Waters Wilderness wouldn't be what it is without fire on the landscape. And that's what qualified it to become a protected area, which is super interesting because when these management agencies come in, they exclude what caused it to become that protected area. And in this photo, Damon is standing on Stockmore Island, which is one of the Apostle Islands where they have successfully returned cultural burning in collaboration with the Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe. So as we think about the future of America's wilderness areas, we have really critical choices to make. Deciding not to restore fire to these landscapes is currently the default for many wilderness areas, but it's also a choice that we're deciding to make. As I hope you've seen during my talk, there are other pathways forward that may bring us closer to both sustaining wilderness and living sustainably with fire. If we take a step back to a broader view of wilderness, we can see that managers are facing more tough questions about how to fulfill the Wilderness Act mandate to protect, preserve, and manage wilderness for future generations. These are some of the questions my research team is exploring in our current work. Wilderness is being deeply affected by harmful human actions, both intentional and unintentional. For example, we can look at an invasional meltdown in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. 35% of this park is wilderness, and an additional 34% are designated as eligible wilderness. Here, the invasion of the Feiha tree, which is all the way to the left, has displaced the native Ohia lehua tree, the photo in the middle, and contributed to an invasional meltdown by facilitating a significant increase in the two-spotted leafhopper. So this is a non-native invasive insect that's known to feed on native endangered plants in this park. So in response to this, managers intervened to stop the spread of the Feiha tree and preserve the natural conditions of the area. Or do they stand back? They let this invasional meltdown continue in order to limit human intervention in a wilderness landscape. So these realities really prompt a deep consideration of what wilderness is, was, and could one day be, and what we as humans, and what role we as humans are once again having in shaping these places. Our team is further interested in exploring an idea which Adrienne Lindholt, the Wilderness Program Coordinator in Alaska, refers to as reimagining the wilderness. As the extent and influence of tribes is more fully recognized, how can this understanding help us to shape and grow old understandings of wilderness? Are the interpretations of the Wilderness Act, which have today become dogma, the only way to understand this legislation and its dream to support the entire community of life found within wilderness? In Alaska's Glacier Bay Wilderness, a reimagining wilderness is taking place to recognize the area's original stewards, the Tlingit. If you're interested in reading this entire article that I'm about to quote from, you can grab that QR code there. So as Adrienne writes in a recent issue of the International Journal of Wilderness, the continued relationship of the Huna Tlingit with their homeland is as much a part of the wilderness character of Glacier Bay as the glaciers, bears, and the opportunity for an unconstrained experience. As the 2023 Glacier Bay Backcountry and Wilderness Management Plan strives to protect the landscape as intact homeland and help perpetuate connections between the Glacier Bay wilderness and traditionally associated people, most Alaska parks are also embracing a new, more inclusive paradigm in their stewardship. In the years to come, we can look forward to additional examples of operationalizing an inclusive wilderness concept that honors and elevates the roles of Indigenous people, addresses some of the harmful misconceptions of wilderness, and promotes stewardship that includes a range of values and connections people have with the land. Adrienne continues, doing away with the wilderness designation, as some propose, would not help correct the facts of history, would not help strengthen connections between excluded groups and natural areas, and would not resolve past injustices, promote healing and reconciliation, or enhance conservation. Instead, reimagining the existing system while creating alternative systems will move us forward to a brighter shared future. Our multicultural society needs wilderness now more than ever. And then at the bottom too, there's a QR code. Glacier Bay put together a really awesome video about building the Huna tribal house in Glacier Bay. So if you're interested in checking that out, you should follow the QR code. So thank you for this opportunity to share my work with you. And if you're curious to explore more, here are some more QR codes that lead you to our scientific paper, a story map that presents this work along with images. And then we have a 10-minute podcast where we're discussing our work and a 2-page science brief as well. So thank you for your time, and I'm excited to get to chat with you all.
Thank you so much, Claire. We will now open it up for questions. If you guys want to leave questions in the chat for the Q&A, we'll go through them. I guess to start you off, an attendee writes that they're from the Southeast, where prescribed fire is used frequently for both wildfire resilience and habitat management. And so they're interested in or curious about implementing prescribed fire on public lands in the West because they've heard that it's not practical on a large scale in these long unburned systems or places that haven't seen fire for a really long time. So they're wondering, how do we reintroduce fire on the landscape out west when some of those fuel loads are a lot heavier.
So the question is about can we practically restore a prescribed fire in the West, given how much so many of these ecosystems have changed in the absence of fire? We can actually. So I want to note that a lot of each different landscapes, different ecosystems are all particular and unique in their own way and have their own histories of burning. And so some of the things I'm going to be saying are somewhat general because I can't speak to all those different nuances. But one of the things that we know is that fires are inevitably going to burn. And as I mentioned, managing wildfires is a potential way to begin to restore those fires to the landscape. But one of the really big benefits of prescribed burning is, again, that managers get to kind of choose when and where that's going to happen. And you're totally right that as ecosystem changes have occurred, our contemporary fires are unlike our historical fires. So there is greater concern about the severity at which they're going to burn. Do they have the potential to transfer to wild and urban interface areas where they're going to be impacting people? So that definitely is a concern. But there are ways to successfully implement prescribed burning. Again, there are interesting questions around that in wilderness because we do know that if you have an area that's particularly overgrown, going in and doing some things like mechanical thinning can help to reduce that fire severity. In wilderness, of course, that's another question because that's a form of mechanization in the wilderness, which raises certain questions. One of the examples that I cite was from the Scapegoat Wilderness in Montana. And in that wilderness, they did end up using some helicopter support for prescribed burning. That area is very mountainous, and being wilderness, it doesn't have a lot of easy access. And so the decision was made that using mechanized equipment in the wilderness to ignite this prescribed burn and thus keeping fire personnel out of the landscape was kind of the safest and the best way to restore fire there. So no, these things are not easy. And, the people who take this on, there's a lot of things they have to consider, but it is something that can be done.
Awesome, thank you. Another attendee asks, it's a longer question, but I think you're also able to see it. But what grant opportunities are available to state, local, or tribal entities to burn in state responsible areas, specifically in places like California, Nevada, and Arizona? And are these funds available from these grants sufficient enough to effectively execute these burns in these state responsible areas?
That's a fantastic question. And I wish that I was better equipped to answer it. I'm not really able to speak to the specifics of what each state is offering. I think generally in thinking about things that I've read and things that I've been told is that more support is always appreciated and needed for burning. I think what we're seeing in California, the agreement that was made with the Karuk tribe, where this depth of knowledge and experience of cultural burning is really acknowledged and allows them to ignite cultural burns without having to. There's a lot of legislation in place about smoke and other things, which does make sense, but can make igniting fires extremely difficult. And so I think tribes. There are many tribes who are restoring fire and who would like to be doing more, but more support is needed. We're in over a century of deficit of fire on many of these landscapes, which means that it's a huge problem that needs to be tackled. Again, sorry, I can't speak to the specifics of those places. I'd be curious to find out those things myself. So I hope good luck in finding those answers.
Thank you. To that point too, I have a question. I guess, do you see barriers for reintroducing fire with federally recognized tribes versus non-federally recognized tribes? And is there what sort of programs are in place? I know there's tracks, but to bring these agencies and tribes together.
No, I think those are great questions, and I think that's one of the huge potentials we see in just a greater embrace of human ignited burning by federal agencies. I think it opens up the possibility for many more partnerships with tribes. Um, I think there's been, I referenced the Boundary Waters multiple times. That's the wilderness area that's really close to me. And I was really excited in speaking with one of their um, staff members who does a lot of work with burning that, you know, as his understanding of fire on that landscape and the collaboration that they have with Anishinaabe tribes is growing, bands is growing, that they're really now starting to focus on burning as honoring treaty rights. And that's becoming more part of the language that they're using when they talk and think about fire. And I've seen that myself, I think, beginning to recognize. I mean, it's kind of helping us rethink how we think about wilderness, right? If we're the understanding that, you know, humans have been active in these spaces, in some cases burning, and how can we bring that back? And so I think we're hopeful that that recognition as it grows is going to increase collaborations. That's a really interesting question you ask about the difficulties between being federally recognized tribes versus not. Again, unfortunately, that's not something I can speak to other than to just assume that not being federally recognized is going to make those partnerships even more difficult.
Yeah, totally. Another attendee asks, does your work also look into the interactions and past effects of other tribal vegetation management tools, like mentioned in Kat Anderson's Tending the Wild, and how that's maybe affected fuel loads and fire intensity in the past, other than just burning? So I guess other thinning treatments, but specific to tribal management.
Yeah, totally. No, that's a great question. That's an area in which I'm really excited for my own knowledge to grow. I really entered this space through fire as the predominant way forward. But I think in our kind of, as I touched on at the end with kind of the next questions that our team is really interested in, part of that is helping everyone, well, not everyone, people, folks like me, to understand how wilderness has been so intimately shaped. So we have that example of agaves being domesticated, and I know all throughout the Pacific Northwest there are various forest gardens and various impacts. So that's something that I'm hoping to be learning more about in the research that we're doing now.
Very cool. Yeah. Another attendee writes they really enjoyed your presentation. They said that you spoke briefly on what it's like to work on a prescribed burn, and they're hoping that you say more about what it's like to work on a fire, and what are the labor issues around prescribed burns.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I had a really unique entry into fire through, as I said, a crew that specialized in wilderness wildfires. That being said, we still spent, I'd say, over 50% of our time working on suppression fires. So I really got to see kind of the differences between approaches to those two kinds of fires. I think wilderness wildfires really showed me in a deep way that we can live alongside fire, and it's not, I don't know, I think I have so much internalized fear of fire. I think so many of us do. I think it's kind of been a century of pyrophobia, Smokey Bear, etc. And so I think actually getting to be on a landscape and spend weeks out there and see what it was like to, I mean, we're aware of the fire, we're monitoring it, we're collecting certain things, we're communicating back with big decision makers back at the ranger station. But I think you can really begin to see what these fires are doing, and they become, again, something to live alongside. That being said, I feel a ton of empathy for folks who have to make those tough decisions about how they're going to approach the fire. I think, obviously, as I talked about, we're seeing such severe fires in the 21st century, and folks have been arrested for prescribed burning. People have lost their jobs when they've decided to manage fires and they've gone out of control. And again, those things are rare, but that's really a lot of what we hear about in the media. So I think one of the things that I'm would be really excited to see would be to kind of step away from our fire suppression model. And there's a really great paper actually by two retired Forest Service folks. One of them is named Body, and it basically talks about how we've set up a federal firefighting workforce that knows how to suppress fires. That's what they're trained to do. And what might it look like if we had a whole branch of folks whose entire job was to prescribe fires or to manage fires, and who really developed that expertise and had dedicated time and funding to do that. Because under the current model, the same firefighters who are suppressing fires are also the ones who, on the shoulder seasons or when they can, are igniting prescribed fires, or being held to manage fires. And suppression fires just take precedence over fire management in that way. And of course, this is a much bigger question because firefighting as a profession overall is facing a real shortage of folks, and it doesn't take too much digging to see that those firefighters are often not very well compensated or supported. And so I think there are some really big issues that need to be addressed in not only the structure of our firefighting workforce and how it can better support sustainable fire on the landscape, but then how we're actually supporting the people who are out there doing that labor.
Awesome, thank you. I think we are close to wrapping up. Maybe time for one more shorter question. Someone asked if you can provide a reference for, you mentioned the Sequoia and King Canyon National Park prescribed fire. Is there a reference for the number of acres burned?
So if you check out our Untrammeling the Wilderness paper, it should be cited there. But I'm pretty sure that was from a personal communication with one of the folks who's a biologist. I think that's the question you're asking. If you go into our paper too, there's a really great figure that kind of shows where prescribed burning has happened and then overlaid with recent severe fires. And you can see the difference in areas that were previously burned, and then how that really mitigated a later severe fire. So yeah, if you check that out, you should be able to hopefully get a little bit more information there.
Cool. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thanks to Claire as well for your presentation. Our next session, which is a bonus webinar, is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m., where we'll be discussing new approaches, remaining challenges, and modeling wildfire with Sandy P. Harrison. And I see that we've also put Claire's paper in the chat if you want to read that as well. And then you can also check out this recording on YouTube and our website. But please keep an eye out for the webinar evaluation that we'll send out as well. And thanks everyone once again. I look forward to seeing you guys at our future sessions. All right, have a great day.
Thank you.